Good afternoon, everyone who is participating in this webinar. The webinar is about abduction in Turkey for now. As you probably know, we are organizing in probably the month of May our Turkey Tribunal. And for that, reports that have been made concerning different topics. We had a webinar last month about torture. This webinar is about abductions, how they are now, how we can experience what is happening now, and also, of course, because it's not a new phenomenon, what before. And so we have different speakers for our webinar. I will introduce them one by one each time. The first speaker is Johan Heymans. Johan Heymans is a lawyer in Ghent. He has been working in human rights associations before, and he is the writer, the author of this report on abductions. So I will give the floor to Johan for about 10 to 15 minutes to give us a bit of resume of his report on abductions in Turkey. Johan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Before delving into the report itself, I would like to explain why we chose for this topic to be included among the reports for the Turkey Tribunal. It is because abductions, particularly if they are state-sponsored, constitute one of the most flagrant human rights violations, because often the people are tortured during the time that they disappear. If they resurface, they are again subject to a wild variety of human rights violations. And so when we were examining the situation in Turkey and selecting the most important human rights violations in our opinion, we chose for this topic to be addressed. This is also an important topic because Turkey has a long history of these kind of abductions. In the 1890s, there were thousands of people abducted by the state, and then in the beginning of this century, this number drastically diminished. But since 2016, we have noticed that it is steeply increasing again, and it is for that reason that we wanted to examine and in fact answer two questions, and it are these two questions that I would like to address together with you today. The first question that we wanted to address is, to what extent is Turkey responsible for the abductions that are taking place? And the second question is, to what extent is Turkey allowing an effective investigation into these allegations of abductions, of enforced disappearances, to take place? Now, in order to address these two questions, and particularly the first one, I wanted to emphasize that I wrote the report, but this report is a result of a lot of people who assisted me and who provided me with objective and tangible evidence, because every time we arrived to some factual conclusions, we really wanted to base ourselves on objective pieces of information. And I received a lot of court records, testimonies, eyewitnesses, camera footage, and so on, allowing us to really draft a report based on the facts rather than opinions or suspicions or anything like that. So let's have a look at the first question. To what extent is Turkey responsible for abductions? There, it is important to distinguish between two types of abductions. There's on the one hand, the abductions of political opponents within Turkey itself. There, Turkey denies any involvement, and I will come back to that topic later on. And then on the other hand, we also saw a rather new phenomenon, and that is international abductions, where Turkey is actively seeking political opponents abroad, abducting them with or without the assistance of the host state, and then bringing these people back to Turkey, and then consequently they disappear and in the best scenario resurface a few months, a few weeks later. So with regards to these international abductions, Turkey acknowledges its responsibility, and there the case study is a little bit easier. But first, let's have a look at the domestic abductions. In the domestic abductions, we see consistently the same pattern. People are political opponents of the current regime. They are abducted often in broad daylight, in very publicly crowded places, and they tend to disappear for a few months up till a few years, or they never resurface at all. If they resurface, they always resurface in the same police stations, in the same circumstance, with the same kind of explanation that these people they were found by the police, or that they presented themselves to the police to hand themselves in as being criminals, and so on. These patterns we notice consistently, and if people resurface, after they resurface, they are then subjected to a prison regime, which also violates or continues to violate their human rights. They are not allowed to freely speak with their families. They are not allowed to be assisted by a lawyer of their choice, an independent lawyer who really gives good advice, and a lot of other human rights issues or human rights of which they are deprived. When we look at this pattern, we saw a lot of similarities between the different cases, but we also had a lot of objective elements supporting our conclusion that Turkey is involved with the domestic abduction of its political opponents. The first aspect is that during these abductions, there were a lot of eyewitnesses, camera footage, and there we could see that the people who executed the abduction, that these people were police officers. They were often wearing the police uniforms. They also presented themselves to the eyewitnesses as being police officers, and in that circumstance, they managed to execute the abductions. Secondly, we also noticed that it's always the same type of vehicles that are used to execute these abductions. Turkish people often explain to us that the only thing that has changed between now and the abductions by the Turkish state in the 90s is the type of van that they used. In the past, it were white vans. Now it are black vans that are almost consistently used by the authorities. We have so objective evidence with regards to the circumstance of the abductions itself, and that's also why it took some time to really understand the scope of what is going on, and the scope is expanding every single day. The number of abductions that we discover is increasing every single day. It is because people start resurfacing, and these people initially couldn't say or didn't dare to say anything, but now more and more victims of these abductions spoke up in court, spoke up to their lawyers, and testified that they were abducted by state officials, torturing them, pushing them to render incriminating statements with regards to themselves and with regards to other alleged political opponents of the Turkish regime in order to build criminal cases against these people. So we have the circumstances, we have the testimonies of the people itself, and slowly also Turkish officials start to speak up and start to confirm that these abductions are state-sponsored. For instance, there's a declaration of Mustafa Tunc, a member of parliament, who also in slightly subtle words, but confirmed that the Turkish state was responsible or is involved in these kind of abductions. So if you take everything together, the circumstances, the testimonies, the declarations of state officials, and then everything that surrounds these abductions, it is for us clear that the Turkish state is involved in these kind of abductions for which they did not take responsibility at the moment. This is with regards to the domestic abductions. With regards to the international abductions, the situation is completely different. This is a new phenomenon, as I came to explain, but this phenomenon is proudly acknowledged by the Turkish officials. A lot of Turkish ministers, have explained publicly that Turkey managed to abduct around 100 or more than 100 people from different countries abroad. They do this sometimes without the consent of the host states where these people are residing, with a squad of officials of the secret services of Turkey, but also sometimes in collaboration with the local authorities, the local police forces, and then they go into the country, they take the people, they do not follow the normal procedures for extradition, and they put these people on planes of the Turkish state, fly them back into Turkey, and then these people, they disappear, and if they resurface after a while, they explain to us and they testified that they were tortured and also subjected to a similar regime as the one that we are seeing for the people who are abducted within Turkey itself. If these people resurface internationally, we also notice that these people are ending up in a similar regime, a prison regime in which their human rights are violated. It's a regime where they are, again, not allowed to speak to their families, not allowed to be really assisted by a lawyer, often confronted with pressures of the Turkish state not to file for certain appeal procedures, not to file complaints to international institutions, and so on. So if we looked at all these elements together and we made a list of all the cases which we joined to the report, both domestic and internationally, where we examined every single case separately, explaining what happened, and also referring to a lot of information that is publicly available and is not risking to compromise any individuals. But we have based our factual conclusions on much more than just that. A lot of information also came through us through Turkish people and human rights organizations who assisted us with these findings. This is with regards to the first question, where we noticed and concluded that Turkey is once more involved with abductions like in the 90s, and that now this sad and dangerous tendency is once more alive in Turkey. The second question that we wanted to address is, okay, we have state-sponsored abductions, but to what extent is Turkey investigating these allegations of enforced disappearances of state-sponsored abductions? And that is important because, internationally speaking, in the human rights fields, Turkey has the international obligation to investigate these kind of allegations and to check whether it is true or not true that the authorities or certain authorities might be involved in these abductions. And there we see that these requests, these complaints filed by the family members in these specific circumstances, it are always the family members who file a complaint, that these complaints are not adequately examined. More precisely, we see that the family members file a complaint, that sometimes the officials, they refuse to even take the complaint, but if they do not really conduct any investigation. And most importantly, the most obvious and important investigative acts are not executed. For instance, if a family member files a complaint and explains that there are eyewitnesses confirming that state officials are involved, or camera footage which could allow to identify the cars or the vehicles used to execute these abductions, that would be one of the first investigative acts that the authorities would have to execute, and these investigative acts are consistently not executed. What we see is that even if the family members, because a lot of families, and we will hear one of the relatives today, but a lot of family members fought very hard for their loved ones and continue to do so, and managed to gather an astonishing amount of evidence themselves indicating that enforced disappearances and state-sponsored abductions have taken place. They managed to get their hands on eyewitnesses, their declarations, on camera footage, and so on. And they tried to join this information to the criminal files, but in most of the cases that wasn't accepted or didn't work out. And if it was accepted, nothing further happened or seems to have happened with these files, because a lot of individuals also face big difficulties trying to access their files. So these files, that is a general issue with people who are in prison in Turkey at the moment, particularly the ones who were abducted and then eventually resurfaced, is that they are confronted with alleged classified files. So they're not allowed to see what is in the investigative file, and therefore are completely unaware of what exactly has happened by the authorities. But in any event, many of these people have been abducted since 2016, 17, 18, and no single state official has been sent to a court or had to appear before a judge in order to explain themselves on their alleged participation in certain abductions. So no results have followed. People are unaware of what happened to them. And this is something that also came to the attention of a lot of international institutions, both the increased abductions and the failure to effectively investigate these allegations of abduction. And we see that the United Nations in particular are very concerned about what is going on. Very recently, in May 2020, 3 rapporteurs of the United Nations and the United Nations Working Group on Enforced Disappearances made a long letter explaining or requesting Turkey to explain itself and to stay away from any international abductions, because they had received very credible information that Turkey was concluding agreements, secret agreements with different countries in order to conduct even more of these international abductions. And they expressed their concern in that document, but also in a lot of other reports and statements on this absence of any effective investigation. So the international community is very worried about what's going on, and their worries seem to be very well founded, because the tangible evidence that we managed to gather over this year, in fact, this tangible evidence showed and indicated that Turkey is actively involved in these abductions. We have been very strict in the number of abductions that we eventually retained in our report to base our conclusions on. So only the most credible cases we retained in our analysis, but we are sadly enough convinced and sure that more of these abductions and cases will resurface the coming months or even years, because now more and more people start to speak up, more and more people appear in court and speak up in court, more and more people see that this situation is getting out of hand and therefore want to address this issue in public, like the statements that we have referred to extensively in our report. This is a little bit the summary of our report. So if I summarize in 2 sentences, the answer to the both questions that we wanted to address is positive, sadly enough. Turkey is, according to our examinations, responsible for abductions both within Turkey and internationally, and they failed to effectively investigate the abductions allegations filed by the family members of the people who have disappeared.
Thank you very much, Johan, for this brief summary of the report. The report, of course, can be consulted on the website of turkeytribunal.com and also through the websites of the International Observatory for Human Rights, who is our partner in this project. Now I would like to give the floor to Emma Sinclair-Webb. Emma is working on the situation in Turkey for the Human Rights Watch. And she has specifically for abductions been quite active around that. She will give us not only an overview, but also some specific elements in a specific case. Emma, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My comments will focus partly on the general pattern that Human Rights Watch has seen and documented, and partly on an individual case that we've looked into. But I want to say some general things about the subject, of course, first. Turkey's had a long history of enforced disappearances. You're calling them here abductions, but the term in international law that we would use is enforced disappearances. And basically, we've looked in the past at the history of enforced disappearances in the 1990s, mainly in the southeast of the country, in the Kurdish region of the country, but also affecting other big cities in Turkey as well. And we have prepared reports on that issue as well. We also have looked at impunity for enforced disappearances from the 90s, and in particular focused on cases from Şırnak province that became the subject of a criminal prosecution several years ago, and when various trials were opened against military officers. I think Eren Keskin may talk more about that history. But I think the very important thing to say here is that in the 1990s, the enforced disappearances that happened really resulted in people not being found. Either a body was found sometime later, or there was never any news about the whereabouts of the abducted and disappeared person. And that is not the same in all but very few of the cases we've seen in the most recent period. And it's a striking difference, of course, that those who have been abducted in the last 4 years have, in all but 1 or 2 cases, resurfaced later in custody or have been released. And I think that's it's important to draw the distinction so that we don't just argue that the phenomenon is a continuation of the 1990s. Obviously, in the 1990s, there were far more cases as well. In the early 1990s, particularly the period 92 to 95, where most of the enforced disappearances happened. In the period we're examining today, since the attempted coup in 2016, we have a couple of dozen cases of abductions, enforced disappearances within Turkey that have been reported. Of course, there may be far more that have just not been reported at all. That is possible. But those that have come to our attention are around a couple of dozen, of which Human Rights Watch has investigated and looked into in more detail about 16. So I'm going to talk here about the pattern we have seen in the 16. So that's not a huge number. So I do think it's very important to be precise here about the numbers, because otherwise there's a risk of generalizing and a risk of giving a rather vague information about the phenomenon, which won't help us argue the case that this is an egregious abuse of human rights where an effective investigation is needed. So I think it is very important, and I will stick to the numbers that we have as Human Rights Watch's own research. I want to say some general things about what we see in the cases. I don't want to repeat the previous speaker too much. Johan has already outlined the general picture. In some of the cases we've seen, there is camera footage of the person being abducted or of events leading up to the abduction and around the abduction, which seems to show the person has disappeared and been taken in a vehicle. And families have indeed been very alert to and very effective in a way at gathering the available evidence. Quite surprisingly, in my view, that they've been able to get hold of security camera footage, witness testimony, and really sort of look at the avenues of how to investigate their husband or wife or child's abduction. In some of the cases we've looked at as Human Rights Watch, there is absolute witness testimony that says the people who abducted the individual in the street introduced themselves as state officials, as police, typically. In other cases, we do not have evidence in the form of witness testimony absolutely showing or providing, supporting the idea that these were abductions by state officials. That information is not always available. We have to say that. In some of the abductions, we've got what has happened subsequently is that the men have been released, but even though the families at the time of the abduction made a lot of complaints to prosecutors, to international organizations, and tried to get on social media coverage of the issue, spoke to journalists. Once the men were quietly released, the families dropped the complaints or went quiet themselves. Now, this is entirely understandable if someone has been released from custody on condition that they don't carry on speaking out about what happened to them, then it is, of course, the person will be too afraid to carry on complaining for fear of reprisals, for fear about what could happen again to them or what might happen to their relatives. And also because there is, a widespread feeling among the Turkish public, I would say, that events like this are not going to be investigated, that there are no avenues of investigation that will be effective, which is, of course, deters people greatly from complaining. Some people then have been released and gone silent, and we have not been able to speak to those men who were abducted and then were released because they've decided not to speak out after that for the reasons I explained, understandable reasons. But of course, that's very difficult because it means that it's hard for us as human rights organizations or as lawyers to continue investigating cases if people do not want to testify about what happened to them. And we can explain all the reasons for why they might not want to testify, but it does bring us up against a brick wall that we can't necessarily take the cases further if people are not prepared to testify. There are exceptions to this, and the exceptions, there are about about three exceptions to this. In one case, a man who was resurfaced in police custody after he was abducted, and that was back in 2017. The man's name was Önder Asan, and he did file a complaint through his lawyer. He was imprisoned and is still in prison. As far as we know, his complaint went nowhere. It was not effectively investigated. Another man who spoke out about his abduction is a man called Gökhan Türkmen. And in February of 2020, he spoke during a court hearing about how he had been abducted. And he spoke in great detail to a lawyer about it, and the Ankara Bar Association produced a report about that. We also spoke as Human Rights Watch to his wife and heard more details of the reprisals against the family for speaking out. And his wife is now in prison. Her conviction for association with the Gulen movement was upheld very quickly. Potentially, her whole case was speeded up, the case against her, as a form of reprisal for speaking about her husband's case. But what we do know about Gökhan Türkmen's abduction and disappearance is that he claims he was tortured. He describes in some detail what happened, how he was questioned repeatedly, and how, after he was transferred at the end of, after months and months and months, he was transferred into police custody before being rapidly imprisoned. And that once basically the family lawyer, the lawyer for the family that the family had chosen was not allowed to see him. He was provided with a lawyer and had to accept that lawyer. And then basically made a decision at some point, and we can't verify this, why he made the decision, but he back in February 2020, he spoke in his court hearing about it. We know that he was also put under significant pressure by officials who visited him while he was in prison. This is his own testimony, that he was visited 6 times while in prison and encouraged to retract his allegation of torture and abduction, which he has not done. We think shedding light on these cases carries some risks for the families, but it also potentially protects the individual from further reprisals. And this is a very fine balance and a difficult balance for, a difficult assessment for human rights organizations and for lawyers to make. We are currently looking at a second case of an individual who has spoken out about his abduction, enforced disappearance and torture, and his name is Yasin Ugan. He has also spoken to a lawyer about his abduction. He has also spoken out in court about what happened to him. And we are looking into that case at the moment. So I would also add here that there are, of course, others who were abducted, who were subsequently jailed, some released, who have not spoken out. But in a climate of fear and a climate where people have been forced to sign confessions, perhaps that they under pressure, under duress, under torture, it is very difficult for people to feel able to speak out, and we have to understand people's reluctance to do so. It's, of course, what we understand too is that a lot of the evidence extracted under torture, which is inadmissible evidence in Turkey's own laws and in international law, and should be excluded from all criminal prosecutions. This evidence obviously may involve, the people may have accepted, those abducted and tortured may have accepted, named other people, may have given information under duress. It's a very distressing phenomenon in Turkey, the use of inadmissible evidence in court proceedings, and that unfortunately continues. So that's what I would like to say about this issue. And I would like to just add that, of course, enforced disappearances are an egregious abuse of human rights. We are not talking about a pattern that, like we saw in the 1990s. There are differences, but nevertheless, even though the cases are not so many, this is an extremely worrying and dark episode that Turkey is living through.
Thank you very much. We have 2 questions, Emma. One is for you. One of the people who was attending asked, when you have sure about the fact there was an abduction, what can be the next action that Human Rights Watch does?
Well, I mean, our work is about documenting human rights violations and advocating for change. In these cases, we've been advocating for full, thorough, prompt, transparent investigations into these allegations and trying to raise awareness of this as a terrible issue. What more we can do is that's a good question. So far, we are not seeing effective investigations into these cases. I think it's very important that the lawyers documenting these cases use all avenues open to them. When there is a decision not to prosecute or a decision that there's no case to answer, of course, you have to appeal that decision and you have to keep on appealing. You have to have a paper trail of appeals against decisions by Turkish prosecutors not to investigate. And only then will you be able to take this issue higher and higher to the Constitutional Court and then eventually to, Court of Human Rights to Strasbourg. Some of the cases of men who were who were disappeared, the families took cases, emergency cases under Rule 39 to the European Court of Human Rights. So there are cases there anyway. And to other international mechanisms at the UN level as well is another possibility. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important that lawyers do a very effective job in Turkey of keeping, building the paper trail, as I call it.
Okay, thank you. There's a second question, and I would ask Johan Heymans to answer that. The question is, following the UPR's promises from Turkey in January 2020 towards the United Nations, what action could you call on the United Nations to address this form of censorship? What's happening? Towards the United Nations, what can be done? That's the question.
In my opinion, the most important thing for the United Nations is to continue to apply pressure on Turkey to comply with their international obligations. Turkey still seems to be on speaking term with both the United Nations and the European Court on Human Rights. So there is still a possibility to work with them. We have seen it, for instance, with regards to decisions of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, where Turkey was convicted in some kind of way for the way they detained and people in Turkey. But the big issue is always the follow-up and what effectively happens on the ground. And there we see that for the moment, not very much seems to happen. So the most important thing for the United Nations is to continue to pressure Turkey to comply with its international obligations, I think.
Okay, thank you. We have still a third question. I will answer myself because the question is, what would be further duties of national Turkish and international NGOs? I think that recently we have a new way of action. The United Kingdom adopted the Magnitsky Law. The European Union, the Council has adopted a Magnitsky regulation also itself. Some countries are talking about. And I think that's a new instrument. It is existing, but it's developing only recently. And it is a new instrument that makes it possible that perpetrators of gross violations, which abductions are, can be, let's say, targeted as persons also in their assets, their financial assets, the possibility to travel and so on. And I think that on top of all things that are happening, using these different Magnitsky acts in the different countries or in the European level is an action that we will have to face in the next months, years. Next webinar that we're organizing, someone will be talking about that also. I think it's a new action, and it is interesting to follow up this possibility. So these three questions by this are answered, and I would now like to ask Eren Keskin to take the floor. Eren Keskin, for the people who would not know, but I think there are not a lot, is a lawyer. She is active in the Human Rights Association in Turkey, and I would really like to thank her for speaking up here. She has been victim a lot of times from persecutions from the authorities, but she has been continued to be active in defending the human rights. And let's be clear, to do that from my office here in Ghent is a little bit, not to say a lot, more easier than to do it in her situation. And I would like to thank you for that, Eren. And we're very glad you're here in our webinar. You have the floor.
Herkese merhaba. Öncelikle şu ana kadar sanıyorum son dönem gözaltında kayıplar daha çok konuşuldu. Ama Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti'nin kayıplarla ilgili geçmişe dayalı bir mazisi var. Aslında coğrafyanın bir döneminde ve yüzyılın ilk büyük suçu bu coğrafyada işlendi. 1915 Ermeni ve diğer Hristiyan halklara yönelik bir soykırım suçu işlendi. Ve bu soykırımdan bu yana maalesef ki yaşadığımız coğrafya aynı zamanda bir kayıplar coğrafyası. Yani Anlaşılabiliyor değil mi benim söylediklerim? Ben çeviri gelmediği için bana anlayamıyorum ama o nedenle Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti'nin kayıplar politikasını geçmişle birlikte değerlendirmek gerekiyor. Bu devlet aklının, yani 1915 soykırımını gerçekleştiren Türk İslam sentezci devlet aklının bir yöntemi, yani muhalif olarak gördüğü, düşman olarak gördüğü kişilere, gruplara karşı kullandığı bir yöntem. Bir kere bunu çok net baştan söylemem gerekiyor. Biz insan hakları hareketi olarak 1990'larla birlikte gözaltında kayıp olaylarıyla yoğun olarak karşılaşmaya başladık. Biliyorsunuz 1990 öncesi Kürt Savaşı başladı. PKK hareketinin Türkiye arasındaki çatışmalı sürecin başlamasıyla birlikte bir devlet politikası olarak gözaltında kaybetme ortaya çıktı. Politikası ortaya çıktı. 1990'larda çok yoğun gözaltında kayıp olayları yaşadık biz. Şimdi tabii o dönem adalete erişim aslında bugün de yok ama o dönem biraz daha korkuyordu insanlar. Sosyal medya diye bir şey yoktu, anlatamıyorlardı dertlerini. Hemen bir göç politikası devreye sokuluyordu. Kayıp yakınları korkutularak bulundukları merkezlerden kaçmak zorunda kalıyorlardı. Bu nedenle de çok fazla hukuki mücadele başlatamadılar aslında o dönem. Çok sayıda insan gözaltında kaybedildi. Biz daha sonra 1995 yılında ilk kez İnsan Hakları Derneği'nin bünyesinde gözaltında kayıp yakınları bir araya geldiler ve daha sonra Cumartesi Anneleri olarak bilinen kayıp yakınlarının oluşturduğu bir platform ortaya çıktı. Ve coğrafyamızın en kabul edilebilir sivil itaatsizlik eylemi gerçekleşti. Bu sivil itaatsizlik eylemiyle, yani Cumartesi Anneleri eylemiyle birlikte gözaltında kaybedilenlerin yakınları bir araya geldiler ve bir mücadele başlattılar. Bizler de hem insan hakları savunucuları hem de avukatlar olarak devreye girdik bu hukuk mücadelesinde. Şimdi bizim en önemli sorunlarımızdan biri şu kayıplarla ilgili mücadelede. Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti maalesef ki Birleşmiş Milletler zorla kaybetmelere karşı sözleşmeyi imzalamadı. Bu nedenle de bu sözleşmeyi imzalamadığı için Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti gözaltında kayıp olaylarında insan öldürme suçunun, cinayet suçunun zaman aşımı uygulanıyor. Yani siz suç duyurusunda bulunuyorsunuz, 20 yıl sonra cinayet suçuna işlenen zaman aşımına göre 20 yıl sonra dosyalarda hiçbir şey yapılmadan bu dosyalar maalesef ki kapatılıyor. Bugüne kadar iç hukukta sonuç aldığımız tek bir dosya bile yok gözaltında kayıplarla ilgili. Ancak Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti evet bu sözleşmeyi imzalamadı. Zorla kaybetmelere karşı sözleşmeyi imzalamadı ama bu gözaltında kaybetme süreçlerinde uygulaması gereken başka uluslararası sözleşmeler var. Örneğin Avrupa İnsan Hakları Sözleşmesi, Medeni ve Siyasal Haklar Sözleşmesi, işkencinin önlenmesine karşı sözleşme ama bu soruşturma süreçlerinde bu sözleşmeleri de hiçbir şekilde Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti uygulamıyor. Uygulamadığı için de sözleşmeleri biz hiçbir sonuç alamıyoruz. Şimdi gözaltında kayıp demek aslında işkenceyle bir anlamıyla sonucu ortaya çıkmasa da öldürme anlamına geliyor. Ve bu insanların ondan sonraki ailelerinin daha sonraki hayatlarında çok fazla sorunlar ortaya çıkıyor. Şimdi bir insanın gözaltında kaybedilmiş bir insanın öldüğünü kabul etmek istemiyor bu aileler doğal olarak ve yaşamlarının her aşamasında başka hukuki alanlarda da yaşıyorlar. Ben bir örnek dava anlatmak istiyorum. Gözaltında kayıplar çok bilinen Kırbayır davası. Cemil Kırbayır 13 Eylül 1980 tarihinde gözaltına alınıyor. Kars'ta. Ailesi günlerce kendisinden haber alamıyor. Hiçbir bilgi verilmiyor aileye. Aile tehdit ediliyor. Aylarca, yıllarca uğraşıyorlar haber almak için. Hiçbir haber alamıyorlar. Yaşadıkları baskılar nedeniyle İstanbul'a göç etmek zorunda kalıyorlar ve 1995 yılında gözaltında kayıp yakınlarıyla bir araya gelerek Cumartesi Anneleri eylemine katılmaya başlıyorlar. O tarihe kadar hiçbir şekilde devletten bilgi alamıyorlar. Ancak 2010 tarihinde ilk defa devlet kayıp yakınlarıyla bir karşılaşma yaşıyor. Şu anda Cumhurbaşkanı olan Tayyip Erdoğan o dönem başbakandı. Kayıp aileleriyle bir toplantı yaptı ve dedi ki bizim dönemimizde bir daha gözaltında kayıp olmayacak ve biz bütün kayıp olaylarını çözeceğiz. O dönem 100 küsur yaşında olan Cemil Kırbayır'ın annesine söz verdi hatta. Ben senin oğlunun davasını çözeceğim diye. Ve Türkiye Meclisi'nde bir komisyon kuruldu. Cemil Kırbayır'ın akıbetini araştırmak üzere bir komisyon kuruldu. Ve sonuçta bu komisyon çok iyi çalıştı. Şu ortaya çıktı. O güne kadar yani 1980 yılından 2010 yılına kadar Cemil Kırbayır'ın kaybedilmesiyle ilgili hiçbir soruşturma yapılmamış. İşte meclisteki bu komisyonun talimatıyla diyeyim artık Kars Cumhuriyet Savcılığı 2011 yılında Cemil Kırbayır'ın kaybedilmesiyle ilgili bir soruşturma başlattı. Bu soruşturmadan hala bir sonuç alabilmiş değiliz. Hala bitmedi bu soruşturma. Hatta 2 ay önce şunu öğrendik ki savcılık Adalet Bakanlığı'na başvurdu. Adalet Bakanlığı Yargıtay'a başvurdu ve zaman aşımıyla dosyanın düşürülmesi yönünde bir karar alınması talebiyle. Yani o dönem devlet aklı biraz daha farklı çalıştığı için Başbakan Erdoğan söz vermişti ama bugün başka bir sürece geçtiğimiz için artık bu dosya kapatılmak isteniyor. Bu kayıplar meselesinin yanında bir de bununla bağlantılı olarak toplu mezarlar meselesi var. Biz ailelerin ve bölgede yaşayan, özellikle Kürt coğrafyasında, Kürdistan'da yaşayan insanların, kaybedilen insanların gömüldüğü yerleri bildiklerini biliyoruz. Biz bunu ortaya da çıkarttık. 1995 yılında Mardin'in Dargeçit ilçesinde gözaltında kaybedilen köylülerin mezarlarının yeri halk tarafından söyleniyordu. Ve biz 2012 yılında Dargeçit Savcılığına bu talebimizi kabul ettirdik ve ailelerin gösterdiği mezarlar açıldı. Ve orada gerçekten gözaltında kaybedilen insanların kemiklerine ulaşıldı. Adli tıp bu kemiklerin kaybedilen insanlara ait olduğunu DNA tespitleriyle ortaya çıkarttı. Yani aslında bir gerçeklikle yaşıyoruz, yaşamaya devam ediyoruz ve o devlet aklı maalesef hala gözaltında kayıplar meselesini bir tehdit olarak ortada tutmaya devam ediyor. Biraz önce konuşulanlardan da gördüğümüz gibi 2016 yılında 15 Temmuz'da meydana gelen darbe girişimi olayının ardından tekrar devlet aklı gözaltında kayıplar yöntemini ortaya koydu. Şimdi bugün burada çok net olan bir şey var. Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti bu tür konularda ne kendi iç hukukunu uyguluyor. Çünkü kendi iç hukukuna göre de işkence bir yasak sorgu yöntemi. Gözaltı süreleri belli. En önemli, kendi anayasasıyla iç hukukunun da üzerinde tuttuğu uluslararası sözleşmeler var. Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti bu uluslararası sözleşmelerin hiçbirini uygulamıyor. Hiçbirini uygulamıyor. Ne Avrupa İnsan Hakları Sözleşmesi, Medeni Siyasal Haklar Sözleşmesi, İşkencenin Önlenmesi Sözleşmesi, İstanbul Sözleşmesi, aklınıza gelebilecek hiçbir sözleşmeyi uygulamıyor ve maalesef ki kendi imza ortağı olan, çünkü bunları tek başına imzalamıyor, İmza ortağı olan devletler var. Bu devletler tarafından da Türkiye yeterince denetlenmiyor. Denetim mekanizmaları devletler arası karşılıklı çıkar ilişkileri nedeniyle maalesef ki yeterince uygulanmıyor. Bu nedenle de fütursuzca hala insanları gözaltında kaybetmeye, bilgi vermemeye ailelere devam ediyorlar. Bu tamamen Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Devleti'nin bir hukuk devleti olamayışıyla ilgili. Maalesef ki ne Türkiye'deki iç muhalefet yeterli sesi çıkarabiliyor ne de özellikle Avrupa, çünkü bu imza Türkiye'nin altına imza attığı sözleşmelerin çoğunda Avrupalı devletlerle ortak imzacı Türkiye maalesef ki yeterince de denetlenmiyor. Bu çok önemli bir insan hakları sorunu olarak varlığını maalesef ki devam ettiriyor.
Thank you very much, Eren, and I think the conclusion you gave was very clear. It's not the law or the constitution that is a problem or the international convention, but it is clearly it is about the respect of it and the enforcement of this legislation and conventions that is the problem. And the weakness of international bodies to monitor and to force the governments to really respect the dispositions of the law, about the constitution, about the conventions, and I think that's the essence. And of course, the story you tell gives us very clear with it the very hard impact of it. I would like to thank also the contribution of Mr. Dimitras. He sent us a contribution, comment. We will send that to Eren also. And we have some questions. There is a question about whether international tribunals can intervene with that. And I suppose if the perpetrators can be punished. And that's a reference, I think, to the International Penal Court, the Criminal Court International, but I will give the floor for that to Johan Heymans about this international court. Can the international court punish perpetrators of abductions? Johan.
The sad thing at the moment is that if you're thinking about the Turkish perpetrators, it's really complicated because Turkey is not a part of the Rome Statute, does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So I think that the answer is no at the moment. So it's a pretty brief answer, but that's the reality, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's clear. It's not part. Otherwise, we would immediately have launched, but you cannot. They did not recognize the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Court. Second question was that with the international abductions, some abductees hold a dual citizenship. And what can be done? Well, we have seen, can also be short, that in some of these situations, the state has complained. The state of the second citizenship have complained, but without impact. I think there is someone from Mexico who has a double Turkish and Mexican, I think Canadian also. So the state can protest, but there's no legal way to do that. And we also saw, I think that it was in Kosovo, that one of the ministers who allowed such an abduction had to resign, but that's all. The victims were not really helped by that. How will the Turkey Tribunal verdict help the abductees? Well, I think everything that is in human rights defense, never you can say that what we did helped to that. Nearly never. It is a cumulative effect, and we want to raise the voices on that. And of course, we will try after the tribunal, with the verdict of the tribunal, also to be in contact and to complain with the United Nations, Council of Europe, everywhere we can. we will take actions, but we should not be here telling you stories. We should tell the truth. We know that it's a job, it's a work of a long, long time. Unfortunately, let's say dictatorship of semi-dictatorships last a long time, but at the end, there is no one who persists. That's the most important thing. At the end, we think that at a certain moment, the rule of law and the respect of human rights can prevail. There is a question about confessions. It's clear that normally confessions under torture or under threat are not acceptable. It is something that the tribunals in Turkey has not been accepted most of the time. There are some judgments even of the European Court of Human Rights, but it is something clearly that the independence of the judiciary, but we will have a webinar later on that, the independence of the judiciary is a key element. If we want the rule of law and human rights to be respected, the first thing to happen is that the judges have an independency and can speak up as they need to and decide what has to be decided. And it's also clear that for the moment, this is a very, very, very big problem. So the lack of balance, I think we have to recognize that if we see the countries that normally are pushing other countries is the European Union or the United States, and so European Union and the United States both have strategic interest in Turkey and are not daring to push Turkey until the point it should push. They should push Turkey, and we see it as well with the United States and with Europe. They have a bit a double speech that is clear, and I think that's the reason, one of the reasons that there is not enough power that is given to the defense of the human rights in this case. Okay, we have the fourth speaker is Mustafa Tunc. Mustafa Tunc. I'm very happy that he is here, and I would like to welcome him here. He is unfortunately what we call an experienced witness, meaning that he has unfortunately been, he's the father of a son who has disappeared, Yusuf Bilge Tunc. He has disappeared, and the family effort to find him, the reaction of the government and so has been very poor, of course. We have a video that is explaining a bit the situation where Mustafa Tunc is, and after that video, he will give us some extra information also. Can we put now the video on the webinar, please?
Mustafa Tunc, 1956 Osmaniye Kalirli doğumluyum. Adana'da oturuyorum. Mesleğim öğretmenlik. 2005 yılında emekli oldum. 3 çocuk babasıyım. Yusuf Bilge Tunc benim en büyük çocuğum. 6 Ağustos'ta eve dönmediğini öğrendim. Ankara'da oturuyordu. Annesiyle birlikte apar topar Ankara'ya döndük. Binmiş olduğu arabayı Gimat mağazalarında kuzey tarafında park edilmiş olarak bulduk. Polis çağırdık. Polis tutanaklı arabayı bize teslim etti. Olay yeri incelemesi yaptırmadı. Savcılığa başvurduk. Savcılık da yaptırmadı. 35 gün arabayı orada tuttuk. Olay yeri incelemesi yaptıramadık. Arabayı kaldırdık, yıkadık ve satışa çıkardık. Daha sonra 6 ay sonra olay yeri incelemesi için emniyetten gelip usulen bir olay yeri incelemesi yapıldı. Yusuf Bilge Tunc, oğlum, o zamandan beri kayıp. Başvurmadığımız hiçbir devlet yetkilileri kalmadı. Her yere başvurduk. Ancak ciddi bir inceleme yapılıp araştırma yapılmadı. Şu ana kadar hiçbir haber yok.
Thank you, Mr. Tunc. We are all under the impression of this story, of course, this testimony. And I think we can give the floor now. I think Mr. Tunc is with us. And if you can talk to us, that would be very appreciated. But for the moment, yes, there you are. Hello, welcome here. And you can
Merhaba, hoş bulduk. Ben Mustafa Tunc, Yusuf Bilge Tunc'un babasıyım. Daha önceki videoda da kesildi oğlum. Videoda da bahsedildiği gibi 2019'un Ağustos ayının 6'sında oğlum Yusuf Bilge Tunc kayboldu. O günden bugüne kadar kendisinden hiçbir haber alamadık. 16 ay bitti, 17. aya girdik. Yani aşağı yukarı 500 gündür oğlum kayıp. Zaman zaman Ankara Adliyesi'ne müracaat ettiğimiz için savcı ile avukatımız görüşüyor. Biz görüşemiyoruz maalesef. Savcıya gidiyoruz, dosya ne oldu diye. Yani biz onlardan istekte bulunmuştuk. Telefon sinyali incelensin, kameralar incelensin diye. Maalesef hiçbirisi yapılmamış. 3. savcı değişti. Yani olaydan bu yana 3. savcı, son atanan savcı geçen hafta avukat gidip dosya hakkında bilgi almak istemiş. Savcı bey demiş ki dosyayı iş yoğunluğu dolayısıyla bakamadım, inceleyemedim. İnceleyeceğim, size cevap vereceğim demiş. Hala dosyadan yani ciddi bir çalışma yapılmamış. Kamera incelemesi yapılmamış. Telefon sinyali alınmamış. Maalesef aile olarak adli makamlara gidiyoruz. Sosyal medyada sesimizi duyurmaya çalışıyoruz. İnsan hakları örgütlerinde sesimizi duymaya çalışıyoruz. Ufak tefek basında duyurmaya çalışıyoruz. Ama sesimizi duyan ve bu konuda ciddi bir araştırma yapıp oğlumu herhangi bir haber oğlumdan alamadık. Kaybolması ve bulunamaması gerçekten çok üzücü. Çünkü bir babayız, bir annesi var, bir eşi var, 3 tane çocuğu var. Çocukların dede, babam ne zaman gelecek demesi veya babaanne, babam ne zaman gelecek, anne, babam ne zaman gelecek demesi bile babam bu konuda şöyle söylemişti diye ifade etmesi, yemek yerken, oyun oynarken, ders çalışırken bu ifadeleri kullanması psikolojik olarak bizi olumsuz etkiliyor. Üzülüyoruz çocukların bu durumuna. Oğlumuzun kaybı ayrıca çok büyük üzüntü. Devlet yetkililerinden, sosyal medyadan, defalarca Twitter'dan bilgi aktarıyoruz. Bir yardımcı olmaları için. Ama maalesef hiç kimse bakılmıyor. Bu konuda bize hiçbir bilgi verilmedi şu ana kadar. Bir dosyayı bile sonuçlandıramıyoruz. Yani savcılık şu incelemeler yaptım, şu araştırmalara başvurdum ama bir sonuç alamadım da demiyor. Sürekli sürüncemede bırakıyor. 16 ay, 17 ay kısa bir zaman değil. Biz istiyoruz ki dosya sonuçlansın, oğlumuzdan bir haber alınsın. Çünkü olay yeri incelemesi yaptıramadık arabada. Araba daha önce de bildirdiğim gibi 35 gün beklettik. O ilk atanan savcı dilekçe verdiğimiz halde yaptırmayacağım, kaldırın arabayı dedi bize avukat aracılığıyla. 35 gün sonra kaldırmak zorunda kaldık. Yani biz bu konuda çaresiz durumdayız. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tunc. We appreciate, and it is a very difficult time for you. Everyone can understand this must be a horrible period, and we hope that you still can find your son back. And of course, we never can erase the injustice that has been done, but we hope that you will get him alive and well with you again. And you have all our support and our sympathy. If possible, we will do everything we can.
Teşekkürler. Adalet yerini bulsun. Yani suç olabilir bir insanın. Suçu varsa adli yargılara teslim etsinler. Yargı bunun suçunun ne olduğunu araştırsın. Ortaya çıkarsın. Cezası varsa çeksin. Biz bunu istiyoruz yani. Suçlu insan kaybolacak diye bir kural yok. Bizim ne kanunlarımızda, ne anayasamızda, ne insan hakları sözleşmelerimizde bu geçerli bir şey değil. Ama maalesef bizim başımıza geldi. Allah kimsenin başına vermesin. Teşekkürler.
Thank you. Thank you. We have some questions, but with what Mr. Tunc said, we are very immediate to the next webinar, which is the impunity. And of course, that is what it's all about. But first, a question. There is a question from Mr. Demirtas, who says, can we say Erdogan's bureaucracy is manipulating to refugees? Maybe due to his refugee problem, European countries are staying silent against mass violations. I think that is surely part of the answer. And the fact that the European Union came in an agreement with Turkey about refugees has played an important role in not reacting to the human rights. The fact that it was a coup d'etat also, of course, during some periods gave freedom to react from the other countries, but we are now quite some time after that, and it's clear meanwhile that the coup d'etat has been an excuse for a lot of things and cannot be used as an excuse anymore anyhow. But we still see that Europe is very, very prudent. I think there is now a resolution that is pending before the European Parliament again. So let's hope that they are a bit more severe than they were in the past. Anyhow, I would like to announce also that now in 21 of January, we have the third webinar, and that is about impunity. And it's very close to what has been said today, because abductions, torture, gross violations can only continue if there is no prosecution, if there are no imprisonments, if there are not judges who clearly give sanctions to the perpetrators. So this impunity will be at the heart of the matter in the next webinar. In this next webinar, we have Nathalie Awasian who will talk, Maria Arena, who is the president of the committee from the European Parliament of Human Rights, Emre Turgut, who made the report on that together with Yves Haag. We have Ursula Casagrande and Michael Pollack. Michael Pollack, he will talk about the Magnitsky Act, because it's a way of new sanctioning actually of all these things. And so the 21st of January, we will have this quite interesting also webinar. For now, I would really like to thank Mr. Tunc. I would like to thank Emma Sinclair-Webb. I would like to thank Johan Heymans. I would like to thank Eren Keskin. You have contributed to that, and the only thing I can do to show my gratitude is to support you and to congratulate, but also to wish you can go on with the good work that you're doing. And we will see once, I hope, in real life, not between all these digital things that is now happening with the corona crisis, but I wish you all the luck and very much courage in what you're doing daily. Thank you very much.